The Mandel Center has now for a number of years been involved in work related to social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, both through coursework in our Master of Nonprofit Organizations degree, and through a very exciting partnership that we have with the nationally known organization Community Wealth Ventures. Through the partnership with CWV, we are offering a variety of professional development options, that is non-credit programs, to support organizations who are exploring and potentially implementing social entrepreneurship and social enterprise activities congruent with their missions. We think we have a stimulating and thought-provoking day of papers and discussions, and I'm going to turn to my colleague and friend Paul Salapante, who wears both a Mandel Center hat, a Weatherhead hat, and an EDM hat to talk about today's agenda.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, it's great to see everyone here. It's one thing to come up with a concept for something. It's another to make it happen. I'd like to acknowledge the work and the efforts of the symposium committee. And if people would sort of indicate who they are when I call your name, that would be helpful. So Michelle Murphy is Director of Professional Development at the Mandel Center, and Marilyn Corman is, shall we say, in charge of many good things in the Executive Doctor in Management program. Marcy Liu, where are you, Marcy? Here, is involved with projects on community wealth for the Mandel Center. Kathy Mills, right, is Managing Editor of Nonprofit Management and Leadership. We also had involvement from Auntie Glavis, who is Director of Business as an Agent of World Benefit. Is Emily here, Emily Drew, who's also working for that center. And one of the things we should mention is, and Emily can straighten us out, but we're given to understand that Business as an Agent of World Benefit is going to be renamed, or has been renamed, the Fowler Center. Is that right? And there is, in fact, a sheet out on the information table that you can look at that talks about this process and the Fowler Center. And indeed, we're in part indebted to Chuck Fowler from Fairmount Minerals Company for his support of the Weatherhead School, which in turn has helped to support this symposium and a number of other efforts. As you can see from our materials, and as Susan mentioned, we are putting this on as a joint endeavor of the Mandel Center, Weatherhead School, and the nonprofit affinity group of the Executive Doctor in Management program. So that's a mouthful. We have all these things. And this all came to be because one of our illustrious doctoral students in the Executive Doctor in Management program at one point said, well, the next logical thing for our affinity group to do is to stage performances. So this is one of them. That was 2 years ago. It took us a full year and a half to do a modest thing, and we're gradually working up, and so far it's culminating this year, not only in this symposium today, but on April 16th, we're going to have a symposium, a more modest half-day colloquium, rather, on nonprofit accountability and governance. It will be something of a continuation of one we had last year. So if you're interested in that, or know other scholarly, practice-oriented people in the region or community who would be interested in that, let Marilyn in particular know about it. And you can look at the preliminary program for that on this green sheet that's out in the hall. Scott, where are you? Scott Helm is one of our invited presenters today from University of Missouri, Kansas City. Is a very important nonprofit center at UMKC, and they are similarly holding a conference on a larger scale on governance, something that they do pretty much every other year at UMKC on April 23rd and April 24th. And so you could find out more from Scott about that if you're interested. Okay? So what are our intents for the day? Well, the Executive Doctorate in Management program that provided the stimulus for this type of symposium is devoted to bridging theory and practice. And in the program, many of our students and, for that matter, graduates have been developing knowledge through the research they're doing. And the question always is, how practical is this knowledge? So the session today, our symposium today, is in part motivated by an attempt to put in front of people research that is being done in the field, some by our graduates and some by others, and to ask the question, so what? Is this knowledge of value to people in practice? And vice versa. Are there issues that are arising in practice that researchers should know about so that they could be addressed in a serious and rigorous fashion? Okay. So that's our intent today. Because we have received a grant for this symposium from the Weatherhead School of Management, we also have some debts to pay. And those debts, according to our dean, are that we should produce some products that can be used in our research and in our instructional endeavors. So what we have done is Marilyn has produced a yellow sheet that you'll find at your seat. And as the day goes on, if you can make some notes on that sheet with whatever ideas you find to be particularly provocative, or perhaps that you think of, not that somebody else said, that might help guide our instruction or help us produce some materials that could be used in classroom or in executive education, or issues that we should be addressing in our research, or ways that we should be framing our research so it would be valuable to practice. Please make notes of that. Also, out in the open area here, there are 3 flip charts, one each for practice, research, and instruction. So if you have ideas that you're willing to share with others, please scribble them up on those flip charts during breaks or at lunch or whatever, okay? And we are filming. So Marilyn, what are we to do about the filming and so on?
It's required that everyone complete a media release and clearance form. So I will have them out of the front desk. Please remember to just fill it in so that we can distribute this and make this wonderful event part of the dissemination process. If anybody objects to this, please let me know.
So we know from past experience that we can expect to have a very vibrant discussion, and we have set this up in a way that there will be presentations, as you know from the program, but we hope ample opportunity for people to contribute their own ideas. If you don't have the opportunity to say it out loud, make sure it's at least recorded on paper with something you leave us, either one of these yellow sheets or on the flip charts. But most importantly will be the dialogue and the discussion that we have with each other. Okay? At lunch, we're going to have talk tables. One will be about the invention of a 4th sector that seems to be happening. Gene Kilgore will lead a discussion at a talk table on that set of developments. And then Graham Hyatt, Graham, if you can indicate who you are, will lead a discussion of cross-sector partnerships in the area of social ventures. And then we'll have a free-for-all table where the topic will be up to whatever you so choose. Okay? All right, I'd like to now, how are we doing on time? Not too bad. Introduce Ray Dart. Ray is our plenary speaker for the day and is the reason that a number of you in the room are here right now, I'm sure, to hear what Ray has to say. And I'm very personally very pleased to see Ray here because I've been stimulated and intrigued by some of his writings, and I'd like to see what he has to say out loud about, about some of these things. So let me give you a little bit of background on Ray, and I may have misplaced my notes here. Hold on. First, I'll wave at you what I think is a very stimulating paper that Ray wrote, or a copy thereof, published in Nonprofit Management and Leadership in 2004, The Legitimacy of Social Enterprise. And I know from some materials that Ray has sent in that that will be a part of what we'll hear from Ray today. Ray is Associate Professor of Business Administration at Trent University. He has a master's in environmental studies from York University and a PhD in organizational behavior from York University. And currently his research interests are fairly broad, and they center on social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, environmental organizations, community development. Okay. His teaching includes qualitative research and ethnography. And the last thing I'll say about Ray, in the hope of embarrassing him a bit, is, well, next to last thing. One more thing is that he, at one time, was on the staff of Peterborough Greenup and then served as board chair for that same organization. So by our executive doctor in management standards, that qualifies him as a practitioner scholar. We're happy to welcome him here as a fellow practitioner scholar. And the point of intended embarrassment is that Ray was named Researcher of the Month by the Canadian Social Economy Hub in September of this past year. So I hope that's appropriate introduction, and Ray is free to rebut any or all of that if he wishes. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, hi. So apparently I'm on, or volume-wise, and I just want to make sure that I've got the hang of this. That's great. First, I'd like to just start by saying how honored and happy I am to be part of this, and to thank the organizers of this event, all of you around here, for the invitation to come here, and for a number of things. Most centrally, I mean, this kind of work in and around social enterprise and kind of both nonprofit and business sectors' involvement in social change is just something that I find is such an exciting, confusing, weird, and yet promising topic right now. And to have an opportunity to sort of frame some of it broadly, I think is very exciting. A second thing that is very exciting is in my day job is mostly being intensively involved with heaps of lovely undergraduate students and not having much time to think about this stuff except during summer term. And so this is just wonderful to take me to another part of my brain for a little while. And third, and best of all, is this is the bit of the switcheroo side of things here, is that while I'm here to talk about this, I'm really here to listen and share with you. I start my first year-long sabbatical very soon. And my family and I are buggering off to Vietnam for a few months and then to New Zealand. And I'm really looking for interesting ideas to follow up on. And I thought, what better thing than when I read about this gathering, what a great opportunity to find interesting ideas and to kind of make some good connections that will follow me through this great year up and coming. So what I want to start with is, because it's early in the morning, and I know who here is from farther west than here? There's a couple people from farther west, other time zones and things like that. So it's even earlier for you. Going to start things off with hopefully a fairly broad map and a broad discussion, and something that can kind of get the juices going at this time of the morning. First conference presentation, I almost think it should involve yoga or aerobics or something like that, just to kind of liven things up a little bit. Anyway, I will try to be, for this to be broad, engaging, and evocative, maybe a little bit provocative. But I want to look at social enterprise here less as the kind of thing that we normally look at it from, which is the perspective of, you know, what it does, how it's important, the kinds of nearly magical things that it can do, and look at it more from the perspective almost of, as a social movement, or a fad, or a trend, or something like that. Look at it more as a social phenomenon. And I do that in the best sense where we're looking at academic practitioners, and that here, thinking of, I think it's John Dewey's, I think, who said there's nothing so practical as a good theory? Is that Dewey? Who? Levine, that's right. Nothing so practical as a good theory. Well, for some reason that I do not quite understand, in the area of social enterprise, we have not really engaged that maxim very seriously at all. And it is bizarre. Anyway, I just want to start. So looking at social enterprise, those just read broadly. The first bit, we always start discussions of social enterprise with definitions, and I'm not going to talk about that very much at all, except that if we look inductively at the kind of papers being presented today and the kinds of really interesting research and practitioner work going on, that it's very large, it's very heterogeneous. It has something to do, most of the time, with marketization and something to do with innovation in the areas of creation of social value and social change, right? So we've got all of that as some kind of a broad field, and that part I just want to do as a little bit of a starting point. But now to look at it a bit more socially, you know, we have an organizational field and a kind of a word, a discursive field that's been created. I think of it as beginning with the definition of this field really becoming with New Social Entrepreneurs in '96. Leadbeater's work in the UK that was published about 6 months after this one is the hallmark kind of publication in Europe. And to see how much the shadow, the good shadow, that this cast has really defined in ways a lot of the stuff that we're still doing more than 10 years later. I was involved in 1998 in Canada with one of my doctoral supervisors, Brenda Zimmerman, in a piece called Charities Doing Commercial Ventures. And in 1998, this was, again, if you think about historically and socially, this is just the dot-com bubble was just bubbling. There was quite an organizational ferment. There was this idea that the future is not going to look anything like the past. When we did our first study of this in Canada, it was amazing. We were interviewing nonprofit sector leaders, funders, thinkers across the country. And this whole idea of social enterprise, and everybody said, you know, well, there's not really much happening, but and essentially that the stars are lining up to be hearing more about this. And so for 10 years, since then, we've had a real social movement in our organizational sector that you all know about. And what we've got out of those 10 years, I think, is really interesting. We have, as you will know, heaps of workshops like this, heaps of consultants and promoters, a lot of reports, societies, blogs. We've got a lot of particular things. When you look at the literature on this, we've got heaps more case studies of single organizations, and single organizations that are doing well, primarily, than we have of single organizations that aren't doing well, single organizations that are doing nominally okay. We don't have population studies. We don't have very many looks at failures, and we definitely don't have much of a sociological or cultural or political context to this yet. And yet at the same time, when you look at what's being written and how it's being discussed, we still have very, very strong claims out here about this social enterprise and social entrepreneurship. These are some of the titles up there, but really, in a lot of sense, social enterprise is framed not as often by practitioners as by consultants and proponents as some kind of a grail out there looking at social change. And I think that itself is really interesting. At a meeting discussing the research side of social enterprise in Toronto that we had last year, we actually had, this was over beer, we had an interesting flash where we were looking at the number of social enterprise practitioners that we knew and the number of social enterprise consultants, supporters, and proponents that we knew, and they're actually more of the latter than the former. Again, really, really quite interesting. So after 10 years, what we have is a lot of boosterism, really, some interesting case studies, and the beginnings of population scale research. And so I want to sort of contrast some of the kind of rhetorical and hopeful side of this, which is very important. I don't denigrate the importance of this hopeful look at innovation in the social sector at all. With the first kind of attempt at censusing social purpose businesses that I know of, which was a group of us in Canada tried to census these suckers in Ontario, Canada, over the past couple of years. And what we wanted to do was, rather than sort of pick a selective sample of whoever would be responding to our surveys, we tried to count them all. We tried to count every single one in the province. We fanned through networks and societies and funders. We asked everybody. Now, we were not looking at all of social enterprises because of the definitional issues with social enterprise that could very easily include just about anything. I mean, if you think of any business creates social value, right? They employ people, they create taxes, they provide goods and services. Those are all social values. So that makes anything a social enterprise if you frame it broadly enough. So what we were looking at were the kind of the paradigm-centered examples of social purpose businesses, these client-employing businesses that Emerson and Tversky looked at, particularly focused, in what in Canada for 30 or 40 years has been called community economic development, right? Sort of relabeled as social entrepreneurship. So we looked at this kind of genotype organization of the social enterprise area, and it has been really, really interesting. We're just getting we got the results sort of together, and getting this written up is going to be one of my first jobs in the sabbatical. But so we've got in Ontario, Canada, right across the lake here. I heard last night that's only 40 kilometers away, which is stunning. That's stunning. 40 kilometers away. Ontario, Canada, Canada's second largest province geographically, most populous province. We've got 11 million people and all that. We found a maximum total of 82 organizations that fit that social purpose business frame kind of broadly, and out of that, probably only 50 or 60 that fit it very specifically. Of those, probably about half were teetering fairly near the brink of existence. Commercial revenue, if you considered the group as a whole, was actually under 15%. And if you look at nonprofit organizations in Ontario, the amount that nonprofit organizations in Ontario get from, on average, from earned income and user fees is usually about 35%. So it's actually the social enterprises or social purpose businesses in Ontario that exist right now of that particular form are actually more government funding and foundation funding dependent than average Ontario nonprofit organizations, less commercially successful than average Ontario organizations. Interesting, just interesting. A lot of great questions come of that. When we interviewed the managers of these organizations about, how they balance this double bottom line idea of clients, funders, commercial revenue, inevitably, funders, government funders in Canada, were the primary strategic and organizational focus. Clients were secondary focus, inevitably, and commercial revenue was actually a third level focus. And these were the organizations whose, articles of incorporation and websites and all of that had them set as these sort of double bottom line social purpose business organizations. Really quite interesting, just quite interesting. And I don't for the purposes of time here, we can look at some of the types that sort of came as sort of common a little bit. But what I wanted to flag here was the motto from the London tube system here about the gap. This gap between, on one hand, the sort of rhetorical and hopeful things that a lot of our very positive case studies about social enterprise and social purpose business and social entrepreneurship say, these things which look very hopeful and sound very exciting, some of the rhetoric out there that says that this is the way the sector, the number of sectors or a new sector needs to go, and an empirical reality that, you know, at a population level at least, looks dodgy, difficult. So out of a total of, you know, probably about 50 organizations in the province of 11 million which fit the type, you know, Ontario has about 45 to 46,000 nonprofit organizations, right? As a percentage of our nonprofit sector, minuscule, irrelevant at this point, 10 years in, 15 years in. And according to the data we got from those organizations, that type of organization anyway, as a group, as a population, not particularly promising in terms of growth either. Individual organizations were doing exciting things. The group as a whole, steady to sketchy. Interesting. Again, some very exciting single organizational case studies, lots of very stomach-churning single organizational case studies, and an average in the middle that is like your small, grassroots, community-focused nonprofit organization of hanging barely onto your existence and applying for grants constantly. So this gap between the expectations and hopes and rhetoric on one side and some of the empirical reality, at least that we're getting here on the other side, is where I wanted to sort of focus and frame this talk. Now, looking at these kinds of organizations from a more of a social movement or sociological perspective is something that I think is going to be our Kurt Levine thing and of being very important. So those of you in this, who's in this executive doctoral program here? Okay, so if you're doing any organizational theory, Richard Scott stuff, organizations as rational, natural, open systems, this is one of our core mantras in organization theory. And bizarrely, it is a mantra and a conceptual foundation of our analysis and our analytical framework that we have never really looked at social enterprise or social entrepreneurship from the perspective of. We have this focus organizations as rational systems, you know, and that's the part of thinking of organizations from the Greek origin of their word, organon, meaning tool, right? Organizations, social enterprises, they're functional things. They're there to balance commercial and social bottom lines. They're there to create social value. And when I look at all the discourse really around social enterprise from a practitioner and really mostly from a research level, we've got that rational systems lens down pat. That's the thing of functionalism, what they do, how they work, and all of that. But organizational analysis, much more broadly, would say, you know, if you just stop there, you're being really naive. And those of us as practitioners, if we shake our heads out of the kind of the excitement of a kind of more rhetorical perspective, we see that the same as well. The natural systems perspective that Scott framed, you know, is really obvious that all of us as part of social organizations, we individually, we have our own agendas as well. We have our own interests, our own goals. The natural systems perspective thinks of organizations to people the way coral reefs are to the fish living around them. That organizations are kind of habitats in which we live our lives and do our things. Social enterprise is a theme and frame that gets Ray away from Peterborough and to Cleveland for a couple days. It's the way organizations in Ontario who are applying to our Ministry of Community and Social Services edge out more traditional nonprofit organizations for grant requests, right? It's a way to seem trendy and current. It's a way to differentiate yourself from your neighbor, right? So social enterprise from a natural systems perspective focuses on some of the individual, very human, universal kinds of interests that we have in these. And this has nothing to do with whether these organizations are good tools for creating social change. They're ways we have of feathering our nests, making our lives easy, making ourselves more high status, differentiating ourselves from the pack. All those things that we human beings and any other life form spends a lot of our time doing, right? Natural, normal, human. And the natural systems perspective on social enterprise, I think, from both a research and practitioner perspective, opens our eyes to some interesting other sides of this phenomena. The open systems perspective. Why on earth does social enterprise mean utterly different things in France and America, or Canada and America for that matter? The open systems perspective is that focus that we have in organizational analysis, that organizations are part of their wider social environment, and for completely non-rational reasons, they reflect it, right? They reflect it. So social enterprise in America is going to be imbued with American cultural values. As diverse and heterogeneous as those are, it's going to be imbued with that, right? You look at American writing about social enterprise, and it's got all kinds of, even to this day, got all kinds of great capitalism, individual, male entrepreneur, in it, right? A lot of underlying American cultural myths and motifs that it reflects. You look in France in social enterprise, and it's thought of fundamentally non-individualistically. It's described collectively, right? And if you know the French, that is an underlying national motif of theirs, right? It has very little to do, in most cases, with revenue generation. That's thought of as something very tacky to apply to social need. Why, that it would be, in a different cultural milieu, reflecting a different system, is considered for a lot of important social needs socially, morally inappropriate, right? Fundamentally different lenses, right? So the rational, natural, and open systems thing, I think, opens up a lot of possibilities for thinking about how social enterprise as a social phenomena works. When we look at the nonprofit sector and nonprofits themselves, social enterprise discussion has come as a kind of reaction against a lot of traditional nonprofit ideas. But, those working in the nonprofit field as practitioners and academics know that the market failure and government failure theories of nonprofits, those are economic and rationalist kinds of explanations, right? Despite the fact that before we had formal governments and before we had formal markets to fail, we had all kinds of social assistance and communitarianism and collectivism and community institutions going on, right? Social enterprise follows just that pattern. When we look at why do we have social enterprise? The readings, the rhetoric out there is we have social enterprise because it's a much more innovative way of producing social change, right? It deals with the fact that governments don't fund nonprofits as much as they need to, or as stably as they need to, or through contractitis, they put too many strings on nonprofits to give them the flexibility to be really dynamic. That's a very rational explanation. It's a very rationalist, economic kind of explanation. It's the rational systems kind of model. But if we look outside of that, we start getting some other ideas of how and why social enterprise might have emerged and might sort of be emerging. And this is where I would like to take some of these. In terms of timing, have I got till about 20 past, quarter past?
We've got about 10 minutes.
Got about 10 minutes.
20 minutes to go.
20 minutes to go?
10 minutes and then we open it up.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Be very well. I am involved in a lot of sort of different work in and around this, and if I get telling stories, poor you. Okay, now, the distinction I want to make is this fundamental one that I frame right here. Almost all of our discussion and research and work has been looking at social enterprise so far from a functionalist lens. That is, it's a rational organizational choice. It's intended to do something and not do something. It's intended to do something better than ways that we have existing ways of doing it. I think our field will grow and mature and improve quite a lot if we take time to also think of it from a more sociological lens as a kind of social phenomenon that has its particular shape and form because of some particular shapes and forms of the culture and times in which it's emerged. That helps us unlock it from the baggage of the conditions under which it was founded. Okay. So many of you will have a copy of that paper I did looking at social enterprise from a sort of an institutional theory perspective. But I just want to ground this very quickly and very broadly in some of the things that I observe as being very interesting about social enterprise and the kinds of organizations that I'm often involved with. So institutional theory's premise is that all organizations are social enterprises, but it's a different framing of social than the social enterprise that we're here talking about. It's that organizations, that we do not want to ever try and understand them outside of their very human context, that these are human constructions, that these are human inventions that exist in our minds and through our minds in our communities, in our language. And institutional theory's premise then is that the way we do things organizationally has everything to do with legitimacy. As human beings, we're very parsimonious. And if we can't make sense of something, we get very awkward. We get very difficult about it. It's why when you look at organizational forms, they're very, very conservative. Most organizations are replications of other organizations, right? So organizations, from an institutional theory perspective, are all about legitimacy, about acceptance. If you don't make sense to clients, to staff, to funders, to other organizations, to other professionals, if you don't make sense, you don't get buy-in. If you don't get buy-in, you don't exist. Even beyond that, if you don't make sense, nobody can figure out what you are, right? And we human beings, as pattern-creating, ambiguity-reducing things, as Carl Weick talks about, we just function this way. So we seek legitimacy in our organizations through sort of two very related ways, one big picture, one small picture, but isomorphism. Isomorphism is the big word just for saying conformity, right? So our organizational initiatives and efforts are going to conform, right? When you create a new university, you've got templates and models to build it from. When you create a new social enterprise, you have new templates and models to do it from. When you create a new child services organization, when you create a new .com, we have all kinds of scripts that we work from. And that's on a very macro level, the isomorphism, but on a micro level, we also create legitimacy through the kind of myths, ceremonies, rituals, and rhetorics that we do. And I just think, how in the nonprofit field, and Peterborough Greenup, this environmental organization that I helped found and just as of yesterday finished chairing on the board of directors, grown from an organization of zero revenue at the beginning of 1990. It's about 1.3 million a year. It's a community-based organization in a city of 75,000 people. It's got 23 employees. It's, I think, the most interesting, exciting, community-based environmental organization in the world. And I've researched a lot of these suckers all over the place. We used to plan things. When we started this organization, we planned things. Now, we have business plans. We have business plans. We used to look at funding, and now we look at investments, right? Substantively, they're exactly the same. Our plans and our business plans, they're no different. They're no different. Our grants and funders, and our investments, they're the same. What we've done, though, has adopted, and you'll find this right across the sector, the nonprofit sector, is what we've adopted is a lot of the myths, ceremonies, rituals, and rhetoric of the commercial sector. A lot of interesting reasons why that. If we look at social enterprises, and this is in the paper, from that sense of pragmatic legitimacy, we're looking at, that's the natural systems side of things. That's who can actually benefit from calling themselves a social enterprise, from believing that there is a social enterprise movement, from focusing, from setting one group of people concerned with social change against a different group of people. This is kind of a political kind of side of things in the sector. Social entrepreneurs, we differentiate ourselves from traditional nonprofit sector managers, right? We think of the entrepreneurial management model compared to the administrative managerial model. Think of those nonprofit, we call them agencies, right? They're agencies. They're these bureaucratic, boring, old, unchanging things, right? That's that natural systems perspective, a way of personally, organizationally differentiating ourselves from other organizations. I want to talk about the amazing logical extreme of this. Nonprofit organizations, social benefit organizations, businesses, economic benefit organizations, that sort of traditional dichotomy. New social entrepreneurs created that idea of the double bottom line, right? Elkington and those, the people interested in sustainability. We've got triple bottom line organizations, like how, isn't that incredible? 3 different bottom lines. In New Zealand, a colleague of mine, Suzanne Grant at Waikato University, is amazing. She's working with an organization in New Zealand that is a quadruple bottom line organization. The 4th bottom line, by the way, is cultural because it works in Maori and Pacifica communities. And so, as well as some kind of social contribution, it's also culturally. Anyway, a way of differentiating, a way of benefiting, a way of privileging certain groups and deprivileging other groups. If we look at social enterprise from the moral legitimacy perspective, we've got all kinds of very interesting things. And here we are in America with all kinds of preference for certain cultural and social forms. The social enterprise movement grew and bubbled up right during the dot-com growth and bubble. The social enterprise movement didn't burst with the dot-com burst, but our language, the whole scaling up, the venture capitalist, venture philanthropy, it's all kinds of dot-com bubble hangover language. It's amazing how we have attached ourselves, we attached our wagon to something that was really current and exciting at a particular time. Now it's also very interesting to speculate and wonder how social enterprise, with its use of business, venture capital, investment banky kinds of language, plays out, especially in a jurisdiction like America right now, where most of the kind of heroes of that discursive family are in jail or bankrupt or living in the Cayman Islands. Very, very interesting to see when what you have referenced yourself to from a perspective of moral legitimacy all of a sudden becomes morally delegitimated. Be very interesting time to observe how we think and frame social enterprise. And I've got a few, in closing, a few of the particular things as a Canadian observing across only 40 kilometers of water. Some of the interesting, and I think particularly American issues. Antediluvian, so before the flood or before the crash in America, social enterprise was really tied with a lot of that very celebratory idea that capitalism and business models and being business-like was just a kind of a golden key to producing just about any kind of good, right? That a business mindset is what's going to take social change over the top. Now we've seen that business mindsets and deregulation and freedom and all of that leads to a number of very interesting outcomes. No longer nearly as trusted as a fundamental cultural reference, probably, as what it was a few years ago. The corporate Wall Street referencing in social enterprise proponents. I mean, I wonder what's going to happen with that. I don't wonder, but I wonder what's going to replace it. But some of the things that in the kind of Obama era, America, that seem to be directions that I would almost be willing to bet social enterprise is going to be tying its wagon to next. And the emerging cultural references have to do with the bottom 3 things I've referenced there. The kinds of horizontal, non-hierarchical kind of partnership relationships that you see evidenced especially in things like fair trade and in a lot of international development-related, commerce and development combined things. A lot of the kind of sustainable business models that are being discussed out there. And there were another thing that is emerging. You know how the discourse of kindness and meaning has reemerged as actually valid, as legitimate ways to speak. That, you know, we don't justify necessarily social benefit in terms of the economic spin-offs, especially because we're not trusting economic spin-offs nearly as much anymore. Discourse around that is shifting to where we're hearing an awful lot more about the importance of, you know, human meaning, of community, and of getting to, you know, some of that kind of post-consumerism world. My daughter, 12 years old, interesting character, she just got massively excited about a pair of shoes. Now, 12-year-old adolescent girl getting excited about a pair of shoes is not very noteworthy. It's noteworthy in that how universal it is. Except she was interested in this pair of shoes because purchasing this brand of shoes would result in another pair of new shoes being given to a child in Africa, right? And the business model for this organization, so connecting with a kind of development partnership, is around that. So the idea of consumption connecting with meaning, things like that are things in the kind of Obama era America, things that I see as tangents away from the kind of venture capital language, the venture capital kind of dot-com conceptions of social enterprise, and moving towards this kind of sustainable capitalism, partnerships, meaning, and slightly more Aquarian models of what enterprise and social enterprise can mean. So just in summary, the social enterprise phenomenon, as it has emerged in America, Canada, the UK, many different jurisdictions, has been looked at mostly from a very functionalist perspective, according to this kind of a strategic management fantasy, really, of these kinds of organizations as rational, specific, goal-focused organizations. We haven't looked at them, I don't think, nearly enough as the very complex human social phenomenon that everything human is. To look at the role of human agency in those things, to look at the ways that language, structures, and hopes are picked up because of historical and cultural reasons. And I think that looking at it from a broader sociological perspective like that actually gives us an awful lot of leverage, which is getting back to a great dot-com word, gives us an awful lot of leverage to then go back from a functionalist perspective and look at really exciting and important ways that these new organizational types can actually work better. And they can work better because of a more liberated understanding of social contexts in which they can work. Anyway, I'll stop there for now. Thanks very much.
So, thank you, Ray. Let's take a few minutes for questions, comments.
Also, if anybody has any particular thoughts or examples, and if you think I'm just out to lunch, I want to hear it. Sure.
I'm intrigued by the notion of how social enterprises have adopted the language of the sort of the dot-com era. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about your thoughts about why that language lingers. Is it just a delay in adopting new language? Does it seem to fit better? Why does that language persist?
I don't know. I mean, the first thing I don't know. Noting that it does itself is interesting. I think most language, most discourse that we use tends to be perpetuated in the absence of a challenging discourse. And that is we talk differently when some kind of compelling, interesting new thing challenges us to talk differently, as social enterprise discourse emerged at a time when we had languages like social return on investment, venture philanthropy, all those things which are very .com kind of related, that was promising a new and exciting language and set of concepts for organizing. And so we hitch our pony to those. What we've had since then, I think, is the, while not necessarily having that fulfill its sort of promise, because it was largely rhetorical, we don't have a solid competing or alternative sense of one. Now, when you look at the Fair Trade Development Partnership, some of the presentations that we're going to have today, one thing I find very interesting about that is we're looking at innovative change models. We have much less analytical and descriptive language for those than we have for the commercialization side. And it's been very interesting when you think of social enterprise as a human phenomena and therefore bound to the kind of small c conservative, means change-resisting things that we human species are. So we look at social enterprise as both economic marketization kind of thing and innovation. We've got a really great, robust language for marketization, and so that's what we talk. We don't have nearly the same kind of language for model change and the kinds of innovations that are in there. And because we don't have a language, I don't think we have much to pull. Sure.
I'm going to be speaking a little bit later today, but as I listen to what you're talking about, it reminds me very much earlier in my consulting career, I spent much time in Asia. And I remember sitting in the office of an executive in Malaysia and looking at their bookshelf and seeing all the same management books that we have in the US and hearing them talk, and they were talking using all the same language, but when you actually looked at how they managed, they didn't really know how to use these tools in a way that was integrated in what they were doing.
Right.
When I think about what you're talking about here and the companies that I studied, which I'll talk about later, which are Ashoka Fellows. So they are what I call, they're social entrepreneurs setting up social enterprise that are high performers.
Yeah.
I feel like they were actually using this stuff, which we're calling language, in a way that was useful to them. They weren't copying it, they were innovating and inventing their own thing, and they were maybe the tip of the spear. And what I'm hearing you talk about reminds me of the folks in Malaysia trying to copy, but not doing it very well. And so I guess what I'll throw out for consideration is that there might have been, in some cases, a real reason for going that direction that actually fit. It's like the tailor that makes a fine suit, it's only good if it actually fits you. You could have an equally fine suit. If it doesn't fit at all, it's really not too useful. And so there may be a bandwagon effect here of others trying to adopt this when it doesn't actually fit. And so that's what it made me think about as I listened to what you're talking about there.
And as human beings, whether we're corporate focused, social change focused, or nonprofit focused, I mean, business, we're all about bandwagons as a species. But what you highlight is that at a population level, that's the bandwagon phenomena, that's at that level of analysis. Within that, we've got some very interesting organizations. And then heaps of organizations doing the kinds of things that you do, which is kind of coarsely trying to hammer something on top of an existing structure. And that is I think that's a very good observation.
Just to follow up, and I think I'm probably a discussant for you, because so I kind of feel like I'm an animal at the zoo. So as someone who's active in the social entrepreneur, I think at least to me, it's very simplistic to just view this anthropologically. And that I think the answer, why do those terms still stick around, is because a lot of those terms were developed for funders who think in terms of outcomes and equity. And I think what you're missing is that contextually today, We're in a period of forced dislocation where non-for-profits are being, at least domestically here in the United States, but I suspect everywhere, will be and are being forced to pick up services that historically were funded by others without funding mandates that go with it. And if anything, I think, as I look out for the next 5 years, it's going to be much more important to be thinking in terms of sustainability, but sustainability was an elemental part of venture philanthropy, because the old not-for-profit model that's been around for a long time relies on donors and has very little accountability. And so there's much more depth in that script than you're giving gist to. And I feel a little bit like Crossfire here, so I'm going to surrender the mic. But I could give you lots of companies, lots of folks who are doing more than just culturally picking up a bandwagon, but are really fundamentally trying to change very specifically the kinds of services they're providing, the kinds of funding they're providing.
It's a very important point, and I think the issue of resource dependence with social sector organizations, I mean, that's in most of the research is described as the primary strategic motivating thing. And if funders aren't funding, then we look at all kinds of different responses to that, including kinds of different kinds of marketization. I don't want to trivialize that at all. What I want to highlight with this is that we have a whole complementary set of concepts and experiences from organizational sociology that we would apply to most businesses, looking at bandwagons and trends and the thin application of linguistic fads and management fads, that we have not looked at the social enterprise and social entrepreneurship side from as well. I don't regard those as competing at all. I regard them as complementary. I think, though, that we have a pretty good understanding of resource dependence issues, say with social sector organizations, whereas the degree to which our language and forms and types and our approaches and all that are reflecting culture and social norms, trends, bandwagons, we just seem to have, my sense is, we have a lot less self-consciousness of that on the social sector side than with businesses that I work with. So that's, I would love to hear more too, though. Yeah.
So I'm somewhat new to the sort of social enterprise literature. And I'm wondering if you could sort of help me understand the extent to which the herding heuristic that you're describing and the use of language and can be explained by simply a transaction cost sort of model, which is, the most efficient way to gather the resources, the capital necessary to fill out whatever mission it is that your enterprise has, you realize is today the language of ROI and venture philanthropy or whatever. And so to sort of the extent that this use of language really is only sort of the path of least resistance to getting the resources and funding that you need. Mm-hmm. And if you're observing a new change, a new vocabulary, is that fundamentally changing the path of least resistance, or mm-hmm. are we now going to see new types of organizations, new types of social enterprise reacting to the desires of those who have the capital, those who are the funders? I mean, if in the dot-com era we saw a new range of organizations emerge because capitalists mm-hmm. had new desires to fund different types of organizations, is that sort of where we're seeing this, like the change in language results in a change in types of enterprises that we see created?
I think that's just such an exciting and important question that I don't think there is an answer for that in terms of research and documentation out there. I think you've got there's a kind of a structuration thing that a lot of people in the nonprofit sector have been concerned about the application of commercial language and all of that, thinking that if we start talking a certain way, we may behave in a way, we may recreate ourselves in ways that we hadn't necessarily intended. So there's that piece. What we don't know is the degree to which new, say language relating to funding and things like that. Say if we look from the resource dependence, the grant criteria and all things like that, the degree to which that has resulted in superficial compared to structural change in the nonprofit sector, and what a really important piece of research to be done. Christine Oliver, who's was on my doctoral committee at York University, she's did an amazing paper in the early 90s called Strategic Responses to Institutional Pressures. And it has to do with, I think, about 11 different strategies that organizations can do when they get the kind of institutional pressures, such as funders saying, we want you to be more business-like, we want your resources to be more diverse, we want your earned revenue. Now, naively, from a rationalist perspective, we would expect, well, if that's what they require, that's what you do. But we know, both from business sector and nonprofit sector organizations, that no, there's probably about, well, in Christine's paper, 11 different kinds of categories of things that you can do when faced with those requirements. You can fib and lie, you can superficially change things, you can decouple, you can change language, you can ally, you can do any number of things to avoid some of the fundamental structural things that you're talking about. And we have, in the organizations, in my experience, we have the gamut. But, as human constructions and playing the funder game that, the sector plays, or the funding game if you're a business, we know that we do a lot of different things. And we just got to give ourselves credit for being human in that way. Every organization that I've ever been involved with has a level of imagination, social construction in how it frames itself. Peterborough Greenup, this wonderful, fantastic, successful, and effective organization, never sends the same budget to any two funders, right? Never does, never has, right? No business applying for a bank loan ever does either, right? We construct things based on all kinds of purposes. That's that natural systems perspective that we've got to take into account. As well as function, we're also playing games.
I'm going to have to call time here. I'm biting my own tongue. I'm self-monitoring, so I don't enter into this conversation directly at the moment either. What's interesting is that we've heard from several people who will be presenting soon today. So I would congratulate Ray on getting us off and running in a way that is going to have continuing impact on the conversation that we have throughout the day today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we will have our first paper session. Mark, I believe you're chairing this, so if you...
Great. Well, we're going to, my name is Mark White, and I'm moderating this first session. We're going to go right to it. We're really eager to hear from you. Scott, as previously introduced, is from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a hotbed of great research, great thinking, wonderful academic center. I think what we're going to do, just to make sure that we stay on time, is go right to work as soon as Scott gets his PowerPoints up. Fair enough?
Yep.
And Scott, while we're getting these up, you've got a clock
Okay.
to your right, and I've got these for you.
I've played this game.
Yeah, I was told when I was getting ready to moderate that we're more generous than Arnova, so that's yeah. So that's a good thing.
This is true.
We're going to give you 15 minutes,
Right.
then a few minutes for discussing my comments, and then out to you, which is where the good stuff is.
And Mark, since you
Yeah.
mentioned Arnova, I was remiss in not saying earlier in the introductory remarks that, as many of you know, the Arnova conference will be here in Cleveland this coming November. So we can put a plug in for the Cleveland area, and hope that those of you who are in Cleveland and outside Cleveland will participate in the Arnova conference next November.
Scott has done a very interesting paper. I don't know how many of you had a chance to look at it. Not very many. You did, yeah. Ray did. Anyway, let's turn it over to you and get hopping, and I'm going to sit right here while you're at work.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for inviting me to be here with you. This is for someone who looks at entrepreneurship in the nonprofit sector at a school that focuses on governance. It's always nice to be around people who are looking at this type of activity in one room. This may be the totality of it at any given time, this number. So it is very nice. Yeah, the segue is actually practical as well as, I think, hopefully useful for you between Ray and myself. Ray actually helped, I don't know if he remembers it or not, but the development of the instrument that informed this work. Ray was one of my content screeners on the actual development of the items within this. So it actually develops nicely. Hopefully it becomes a nice segue. I would love to tell you that I sat down and I thought what would be a great research project. But the reality is I wanted to do things far more interesting than this, but I couldn't because as a quantitative researcher, there were no metrics to measure entrepreneurship in the nonprofit sector. So I fell back to this by default. So it wasn't, this is something that I kind of stumbled on more than actually envisioned strategically, which is ironic because entrepreneurship as positioned here is a strategic idea. My title is kind of an homage to Thorstein Veblen. I don't know how many people are familiar with Veblen, but Veblen, who is kind of given the father of institutional economics, which is more of my background than anything else, is from economic orientations. And the institutional realm is anything but rational. They don't believe in rationality. And so he beyond taxonomy, he got tired of these taxonomical debates in economics, and I was also exhausted with the taxonomical debates in entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship in particular. And so my hope was to begin to move this forward. I don't know if it was successful in that way, but we'll find out, I guess, in the next 5 to 10 years. So what I really wanted to do was my goals of the research, and I should note that a doctoral student one of my doctoral students worked with me on the actual paper that came out or that will come out in NML in sometime in the future. He isn't here, obviously. So, but Frederick Anderson was participatory in this process, and so I was grateful for his assistance. I wanted to refine and develop a conceptualization of social entrepreneurship, particularly for research purposes. Okay, so that's one of the things that's important to understand. I really don't look at value in that social entrepreneurship is more valuable than social enterprise, which I make a distinction between, more valuable than traditional nonprofit practice, more valuable than business social venturing. This is not one is greater than the other. It's really to operationalize it for research purposes to better understand what's going on. And as part of that is to build and test an instrument that can measure social entrepreneurship. Now, some of the existing research, and Ray did, I thought, an excellent job of kind of capturing what's really going on out there. Social entrepreneurship, and I'll speak specifically about entrepreneurship. I actually think there's a distinction between enterprise and entrepreneurship. And although in Ray's 04 article, he makes the point that no one really knows what that distinction is, although I will make that distinction. Social entrepreneurship has grown. It's not shrinking definitionally, it's growing to include for-profit organizations, nonprofit organizations, as well as government organizations, which is maybe this is the appropriate venue for this discussion because it is kind of at an intersection of nonprofit and for-profit study. I wanted to argue that point a couple years ago. I've quit. I can't win that argument, and so I concede social entrepreneurship occurs in all three of these domains. So what I will talk about more specifically is nonprofit entrepreneurship as a subset of the overall social entrepreneurship. There are some common themes, one of which is that this idea of change agents. Ray talked about. The other is value creation, although my colleagues at the Midwest Center, Dave Renz and Bob Herman, who those of you active in nonprofit pursuits are familiar with, did a very well-cited article several years ago on organizational effectiveness. And what they said is that effectiveness is essentially kind of socially created, socially constructed. Well, value is really the same thing, is socially constructed. Now, very small segue. We don't admit to this in the economics world, in the reality. But the reality is economics value in the for-profit sector is socially constructed also. Profit and the models of what we know about entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurs don't create entrepreneurial ventures to make profit. It's rarely the incentive. So it's also socially constructed there, although there's not enough time to have that discussion today. Some of the conflicting ideas, which I think are relevant to understanding social entrepreneurship or nonprofit entrepreneurship in this context, is the commercialization versus innovation. Again, one's not better than the other. However, I think there is an environmental context at play, and there are certain organizations that can be very entrepreneurial in the nonprofit sector without being commercial. However, there is some kind of tension that exists between some of the definitions, commercial versus innovation. Scale versus new entry. I know we're going to talk a little bit about scale later, actually in this particular session, versus new entry. Now, there's a couple of different monitors out there on the entrepreneurship side. One's called the Social Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is really just an extension of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which defines entrepreneurship as basically anything new. I obviously don't do that. I don't think starting up another, opening up another YMCA branch in Greater Cleveland is entrepreneurship. It's replication. And not that replication's a bad thing, but there's actually some distinctions that could be made between going to scale and new entry and the role they have for entrepreneurship definitions. And then, obviously, because of some of these ideas, there's, I think, a need for empirical validation. And one of the things that was particularly concerning to me is that, to somewhat admit to my bias, and this is captured, and the only research I've seen on this is by Foster and Braddock, who did kind of a study of nonprofit organizations that tried to do commercial ventures, and about 75% of them failed, and failed miserably. It's a Bridgespan study that was in Harvard Business Review, I believe, a couple of years ago. And that was one of the alarming things, is that do we have the skill set necessary and the capacities necessary to transition from traditional philanthropic activities and fund generation to more commercial exchange capacities, because they are different. And we don't necessarily think of those things. And there's a great vignette in there that can describe it much better. I settled on the above definition. I won't read it to you because you don't need me to. The one thing I would like to highlight about this is that, again, it's an academic definition in this context because it's designed to be operationalized for research. 2, I took value out of it. The original copy had value in it. I took value out because value's socially constructed is kind of the assumption I'm making. So there's no reason to talk about creating value, because there's no way to, value creation is going to be measured idiosyncratically by the group that's actually doing the value creation. And we have there's actually conflicting views of value in all sectors, but particularly the nonprofit sector. And then most importantly, the combination of innovation, risk-taking, and proactiveness. And as you'll see here, that the conceptual model that I'm discussing today, social entrepreneurship, actually occurs directly at the intersection of these 3 activities. This is not new. This is borrowed, essentially, from the for-profit literature, and particularly entrepreneurial orientation and strategic management. Unfortunately, the for-profit literature does not have consensus on what is and what is not entrepreneurship either. And when a lot of the initial definitions of entrepreneurship that came over to the nonprofit sector were, and this is an opinion, were the most simplistic and unrefined. And as a result, we never dug deeper into some of the more current thinking on entrepreneurship in the for-profit sector. And this is entrepreneurial orientation is the foundation for it. I've actually modeled it as behavior instead of orientation. But the idea here is that only when these 3 activities occur in unison does entrepreneurship occur in the nonprofit sector. As you can see, there's no mention of money up there anywhere. What's that? There's money behind it. There's money behind it? Maybe. Well, here's some definitions because true to form with any type of conceptual development here, you have to define the things that you're using to define the concept you're measuring. And so I offer some definitions for innovation, proactiveness, and risk-taking. I don't think anything up there is terribly surprising to you, except I'll say that proactivity is kind of been emerged as a critical concept in this conception of entrepreneurship. Research I've done with David Renz actually more recently, and also with Frederick Anderson, is that proactivity is actually almost the first thing that entrepreneurs do in the process. So engaging in some sort of market creation or involved through networks, this kind of the social aspect of it, accessing bridging and bonding networks, being market leaders occurs sometimes before the innovation. We did some qualitative research, and I don't want to generalize from it, but out of all the 5 entrepreneurial organizations we looked at and discussed, the actual innovation resulted due to ideas that were generated kind of from the market. Rarely the idea was generated by the entrepreneur. Drucker says this. This is not new either, okay? Drucker said this, that the light bulb idea, the great idea, accounts for about 90% of the failure and about 10% of success of entrepreneurial ventures. But we often think, when we say entrepreneurship, we often think about coming up with that next great idea, coming up with the next MySpace or Facebook, to be, I guess, more current. But it's actually not. It's usually an idea that it's a combination of activities. The other thing I'll say, in moving on to risk-taking, is that entrepreneurship, nonprofit entrepreneurship, in this context, as I frame it, is actually based very much on the Schumpeterian model. Okay, so I went back to Schumpeter. I wanted to kind of start over and build up kind of a conception from that which is new, but also that which informed the original. And the nonprofit entrepreneur oftentimes does not bear the financial risk. So it oftentimes, and this is true in the for-profit sector, okay? The financier bears the financial risk. The entrepreneur bears the social risk, the prescription, the ostracization of the failed venture. So you wear the albatross. If you fail, you wear the albatross of having the bad idea more than you do of the bankruptcy, because the money funding it comes from a different source. So in the nonprofit sector, that seed money may come from the foundation, or I would say venture philanthropy, but there's just not enough money in it yet for it to really be kind of seeding a lot of these ideas. But that's where the money oftentimes is coming from. It's not necessarily coming out of the personal pocket of the entrepreneur. So the risks that I look at more specifically are those of reputation in particular. Okay, 2 groups in order to test this instrument. I didn't go through the entire instrument development process here because it's somewhat protracted discussion. I will give you the kind of the quick rundown. Developed an instrument based on research, literature, sent it out to experts, people who have been studying entrepreneurship for some time, asked them to make sure that the items were clear, comprehensive, covering innovation, covering risk-taking, covering proactivity, and then any areas that I'm missing, suggestions, revised the instrument, and then sent it out to this developmental group, okay? And the idea behind the methods behind this, when you're developing an instrument for any purpose, I do this, and I do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations around evaluation, and we develop instruments all the time for evaluation purposes. It's not any different than what I'm doing here. It's just scale development is all I was trying to do. The idea behind it is you have to have 2 groups in this particular case, because the developmental group verifies that the 3 scales of innovation, proactiveness, and risk-taking hold up, so that they are internally consistent. And then theoretically, the hypothesis was, when I tested it on the entrepreneurial group, it would become 1 scale, okay? So it would co-vary. Everything would be, you would have 1-factor loading versus 3-factor loadings. Okay. It's essentially what I just described here. There was a distributional analysis just to make sure that we didn't have any particular outliers, trying to get the group to be, it was randomly selected, but non-response bias. We tested for that, see if there was a particular group that was not represented in the data, did an initial principal component factor analysis. It's actually misleading to call it a factor analysis, a principal component analysis. And the initial analysis came back with, I think, 5 factors, pretty traditional in this type of scale development. You kick out the factors that loaded on the wrong theoretical models, did a second factor analysis, and I have 3 factors, okay? And it met the theory, okay? Those that were innovation loaded on an innovation factor, those that were proactiveness loaded on a proactiveness factor, those that were risk-taking loaded on a risk-taking factor, okay? And so that was essentially, and the reliabilities were all greater than the necessary reliabilities for a Cronbach's alpha. And that's, just the general statistical test for reliability. The environmental group, the entrepreneurial group, this group was a bias sample. It wasn't randomly selected. My fellows in institutional economics love that. People in public administration hate it. But the reality is that we needed a group of entrepreneurs in order to test whether this instrument would measure entrepreneurs the same way, consistent with the hypothesis. So we needed to have a group of people that were just entrepreneurs. Otherwise, we wouldn't know whether the variation occurred because they weren't entrepreneurial or because the instrument was faulty. So we did the group was selected through consultation with websites, consultation with an expert in the area around kind of hand-picking a group of entrepreneurs. We ran them through we gave them the survey, we ran them through the factor analysis, and with the exception of one item, which I discussed more fully in the paper, we got that one factor. We got a unifactor. Now, the foundation for this method is based on, again, strategic management theory. If you can go back to Cohen and Slevin, and they actually used this in, I think, 89 or 90 to test entrepreneurial orientation scales. We also, because just getting one factor doesn't necessarily mean that entrepreneurial organizations exhibited higher levels of behaviors in each of those areas. So we actually also did a difference of means test between the non-entrepreneurial organizations and the entrepreneurial organizations. And these are what our findings were. Innovation, risk-taking, and proactiveness co-vary among the entrepreneurial organizations. Okay, so those organizations that were picked as entrepreneurial organizations actually did co-vary the way we expected them to. Innovation, risk-taking, and proactiveness were essentially unified to become one behavior, similar to the Venn diagram at the beginning. Social entrepreneurship scale scores were significantly higher, statistically significantly higher for the entrepreneurial group. Let me pause quickly and say, the person who picked the entrepreneurial organizations and the research we did on that we didn't say pick the organizations that meet innovation, risk-taking, and we asked them to pick organizations that had created some new idea in the previous 5 years. Okay, so it wasn't as endogenous of a process as it may appear. There's no relationship between entrepreneurship and earned income. I said earlier that I would try and draw a distinction between, and one of the impetus for this study was that is there a difference between purely being entrepreneurial and that of earning income, like commercialization. We did regression analysis, we did bivariate correlations, and we found there's no relationship. So you can have very high entrepreneurship scores of being innovative, proactive, and risk-taking. You can be a market leader in the nonprofit sector without, doing commercialization. They're different tools for different purposes, is how we're interpreting this. Okay, so that there is a reason to maybe draw a distinction between social enterprise and social entrepreneurship. Okay. I ended with a little bit of time left.
Any final comments?
The only other thing that I'll say is that we're continuing to elaborate upon this. We're trying to use this now to look at governance also, to get back to the original point of why I even stepped into this field. I think it's extremely important, I want to continue to reiterate this, is that one, this is about nonprofit entrepreneurship is really the subset. We looked at charitable organizations in the United States. Two, we have tested this recently in Sweden, and we got similar results. We're actually working on writing up a paper on that. The doctoral student I'm working with is from Sweden, so And there's a cultural scale called the Hofstede scale that essentially says that Swedish culture is the polemic of the US culture. And so we figure, and they should have lower entrepreneurial rates according to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and well, they don't, according to this type of behavior. They may have less new entry. They may have less like franchises, less new startup businesses. But again, we don't define entrepreneurship as startup businesses. A new McDonald's is not entrepreneurship; it's a new business. And then, so we found the same results, that entrepreneurship exists in a similar area, similar degree in Sweden as it does in the United States. Finally, there is some work emerging now that I'm interested in that will continue to move in this way of how can we analyze markets now? How can we begin to look at what is the market concentration of entrepreneurship in a given environment, entrepreneurial nonprofits versus non-entrepreneurial nonprofits versus, and looking at it whether that market is more commercially oriented versus less commercially oriented. And we can do that, and we're beginning to do that. Dave and I are beginning to do work on that as it relates to board structure, governance systems, board structure, and in Kansas City. So we're continuing to kind of evolve and develop this stuff and do things that hopefully continue to be more and more practical for the practitioners out there as well. There's a finish. Okay.
You want us to, do you want to stay there?
Do whatever you want me to.
Okay, all right. So could you back that slide up to the 3, that?
Of course.
No, one forward. My job as a discussant is to address a couple of pretty simple questions, and these are my opinion. But the first one is what core ideas have practical value? And what I really liked about this thing, I like the scale. It's nice to see that and see that scale being tested. But I really liked this word right here, which was really helpful. I mean, because right now, I think you start out by saying there are all these debates. My twin brother, Paul, identical, wrote a book called, social, I read it last night.
Yeah.
Social, which really is a book-length debate on whether it's personal or organizational. Is it heroic, right?
Mm-hmm.
The heroic, the 1 in 10 million, or is it organizational? You chose organizational. So he weighed in, and so it may have some issues with the Ashoka fellows that are more, individual and uncommon heroes at Skoll. And
I define organization very, very loosely, though.
okay, you mean so you could have an organization of one?
Of none.
Of none. Okay. What was helpful to me, that was one thing that was a takeaway. Here, distinguished scholar, practitioner from great school, saying it's organizational. I liked this word, which for me, said, okay, now I know. Were you first in the industry? Yes? No. Yes, you're an entrepreneur. No, you're a replicator. Or, you may be what would you call that person?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good word. I mean,
replicator,
franchise. I mean, for-profits, they call them franchisees, right? So, yeah.
Did you have a?
Well, as I've seen it in the entrepreneurship literature and the like, you don't need to actually be the first. It's really before there's a dominant design. And there's a whole bunch of innovation going on by multiple ones.
That's a very important distinction. It's not necessarily the first as much as it is one of the first.
Yeah.
Sure,
exactly.
yeah. But still, this was really helpful to me, and it was in your scale.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you used in your scale, you actually did choose the word first.
I did.
Okay, so in this, and that's helpful to me as a practitioner. At least I know what walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Was I really early? Was I in that
Mm-hmm.
on Rogers, adopter scale? I was in that first 2.5%, maybe. I thought that was really helpful and added value because, well, it just did. I liked it a lot. I liked it that you said earned income is not necessary, and you added empirical evidence to that. So that supports, more of the D's.
Exactly.
It kind of clears up the, well, helps the, you didn't want to engage in these debates, and yet you did.
Because I've lost most of them.
Yeah, but you made a case, so you didn't lose this one. So I thought you supported this idea of a troika, new, first, disrupting, and I like that. It helped me say, but I mean, it is here, kind of new, first, and disrupting. Those words just jumped out at me. So I like that because it helped me to know what I was looking at. All right, so that's what my takeaways were, and we'll be out of this paper by 10:30, and we'll be right on time. Everybody will get to eat on time, so that's a good thing. And how would these ideas be placed into action? I guess I struggled with that a little bit more. Who within an organization would take the initiative? Because it was a behavioral approach, I struggled with that.
Sure.
So, because behavioral, do organizations behave, or is it, I guess I felt like this was an upper echelons issue.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And actually, echelon theory and the for-profit org theory is being used by entrepreneurship scholars now to argue that entrepreneurship occurs at a team level. It rarely, if ever, occurs at an individual level.
But it's a behavioral
Yes.
issue, and you get into this. I thought it was really interesting because it looked like it was, in some respects, a trait. It had sort of a trait approach to it. To me, if it's at the upper echelon, it's really a leader. There's some leadership elements to it. It's behavioral, and I wondered. I wondered about that. I also wondered about the issue of context. You did this study when?
2005, I think.
So it was that what Ray was talking is pre-crash, and I wondered about that. I wondered about the challenges that would be encountered in taking action. If you use this definition, it kind of fits with what you were talking about earlier. I couldn't believe. I thought it was shocking when you said how many organizations in Ontario. There were, did you say 60?
50 or 60.
Out of how many?
45 or 46,000 nonprofits.
But you didn't look at 45 or 46. But it's nothing. And this, for me, those three words, new, before, and disrupting, explain that. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I know you didn't find any relationship between size, and I don't know if that came.
Yeah.
There was no relationship between the 57 in the entrepreneurial category and size, right?
Exactly.
Age, when you talked about it, you're talking about organizational.
Yeah, organizational age.
And employee category.
Yes.
What did that mean?
So a number of employees. So we asked about a variety of demographic questions also. Theoretically, entrepreneurship says small organizations, young organizations, they're your entrepreneurs. No, that's not what we found at all. We actually found that there's probably a relatively even distribution. If there's anything, and we're playing with this now, there's a U-shaped curve where it's almost that new organizations, yes, tend to be a little more entrepreneurial. Older organizations also there's a turnaround stage where organizations tend to get entrepreneurial again also. And they're larger, bigger budgets, more employees, but they still can be very entrepreneurial.
I thought that was really interesting. And to your point about the smallness, you could see that crop up in the size of the samples. You had 410 going out to development. Why did you call them development, by the way?
That's just a methods. When you're doing scale development, they call that the developmental group.
I thought it was a neutral word. I thought you were just, what do you want to be, the development group or it's better than saying, I want to be non-entrepreneurial.
Which would be consistent with the nonprofit sector, right?
Yeah, but
We define by what we are not.
But I'm thinking,
right?
I'm getting the survey, what group are you in? You're in the development group, you know. That's what my wife puts me in, you know, so. Anyway, I thought even though you engaged in this debate, that you said it was organizational level, ultimately you ended up supporting sort of this uncommon heroes approach. Because there were so few of them. There were some things that, you know, part of my role is to discuss and say, well, what kind of issues did I have? I only had one. I mean, that was a big one, and that was the choice of the samples. I mean, you went to, you know, to foundation sites, picked the agencies, right? And then you vetted that sample. You didn't
do it through research to see if they did have some entry.
Yeah, so they might have, you know, they already know what they are in some respects.
Potentially,
Yeah, you know, because they've got to know they're on that website. So they may be talking the way that we expect them to talk. That was the only, you know, they were small samples, but you recognize that in your paper. I had, there's another question before we open this up. Claims that face great difficulty in implementation. You know, I just thought that, you know, this is tough work, very dangerous, you know, so, you know, that new, not such a big deal. Before, bigger deal. Disruptive, very big deal. Very high risk stuff. And I thought, well, you know, it's tough to be, you know, among the first out there because you might get shot to pieces. I don't know what you do if you find yourself in if you're a risk taker and you find yourself in an organization that isn't culturally, you know, that's something you'll address later, I suppose.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, I mean, if the culture isn't there, what do? You get everybody to drink Red Bull all day long? I mean, how do you deal, you know, how do you know, come into an organization that's in a period of equilibrium and they're really comfortable and it's really good? You know, how do you move to entrepreneurial? That was one of my claims or concerns. What would what would your peers say about the ideas proposed in this study? Well, I do have peers. I've had peers. I ran a nonprofit for 20 years. And the ones that are entrepreneurial, according to this, would say, I told you so. And the ones that aren't entrepreneurial would say, Lord, help me, what's next? Now, I think because of the situation we're in economically right now, maybe that's gone down a little bit. The push now, at least in my community, is for merger. It's not for earned income, you know. So I think rather than take any more time, let's open it up to questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to ask about current research thinking about the linkage between social entrepreneurship and social business.
Okay.
I know from a practitioner point of view, the thinking is changing. I remember listening to Professor Yunus Mohammed, a Nobel Prize winner on microcredit at the World Economic Forum in January. He's saying that from practitioner point of view, there is a change from social entrepreneurship to social business. He started a Grameen Bank, is an Ashoka Fellow and a social entrepreneur in Bangladesh. And he didn't take the initial financial risk, just as you talk about risk taking, you know, borne by a third party. He got a grant to start the Grameen Bank, which had become a very big enterprise.
Yes.
But after that, he began to take risk, moving from banking, microcredits, to water supply, sanitation, and even healthcare. And at that point, he began to take financial risk. So he's saying that there is a change, a paradigm shift in social entrepreneurship to social business. I don't know, what's your current thinking in terms of research about that?
Yeah, and I think I would have agreement from the entrepreneurship thinkers out there as well, in that all I've done is I've tried to distill a framework of entrepreneurship that is generic to multiple sectors and apply it to the nonprofit, see how well it works in the nonprofit sector. So And my lit review in the paper, I think, documents that to some degree. And so I think that what you're talking about, it makes sense, because I don't necessarily think entrepreneurs always think, well, I'm doing this because I'm a nonprofit, or I think they'll pick the form. Structure of the organization is a tool that you'll utilize whatever tool helps you best meet your ultimate ends. And so becoming a social business may enable you to scale better. I mean, scaling in the nonprofit sector, which is not necessarily my area of expertise, but there are inherent challenges associated with it because of how do you capitalize. I mean, capitalization in the nonprofit sector is more challenging, which is why we've seen some hospitals in the U.S. move from, I mean, in Kansas City, we have a great example of this. Health Midwest got bought out by HCA, and it was because of scaling. It was because of capitalization issues. They couldn't capitalize the same way. So I don't think there's anything inconsistent with that and what I discuss here. I focus on nonprofits, one, because it's what I focus on, and two, because there are inherent strategy decisions that are unique to charitable organizations in the United States. And I would imagine, as we will continue to look internationally, because they are nonprofit.
Scott, you may be aware, I know that you mentioned that in the for-profit that clearly small organizations are seen as entrepreneurial.
Sure.
But as you may be aware, they've coined the term intrapreneurial for large organizations. There's also a lot of research, dynamic capabilities or ambidextrous organizations. What we found in the for-profit side is that the half-life of large corporations is shorter and shorter, but the ones that do survive actually have to do this and be more entrepreneurial one way or another. And I suspect that's probably the same in the nonprofit sector, that the large ones that will survive over time have to adapt to that new environment and become more entrepreneurial. And maybe that's what you were picking up, but I'd be interested in your comments on those observations.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And I am familiar with entrepreneurship. I need to become more familiar with it because I'm trying to figure out, is it just another label for the same thing, except now we're using it with larger organizations. Corporate entrepreneurship is another one that I've seen in some of the entrepreneurship literature. But yeah, I think that is what I'm picking up on, is that I think, because a lot of it's between that 10 to 20, a lot of the older organizations, I'm speaking extemporaneously now, so I think it's somewhere, it was either 15 to 25 or 10 to 20, which wouldn't necessarily be inconsistent with they've kind of met their useful life for their original idea, and now they need to kind of reinvent themselves because their environment's changed.
And the entrepreneurial orientation, as I understand it, has been used in large corporations or large companies as well as small ones. So that you built on that. So I do think the parallels, like you were pointing out, are quite strong between for-profit and nonprofit here.
I would agree.
I don't think the assertion you made is necessarily true. For one phenomenon, which is a for-profit contract, you have stakeholders, you have shareholders. In a not-for-profit contract,
Actually, I believe it's the reverse, which is older not-for-profits that have coalesced missions, in some cases with endowments, actually have a much longer running space, even if they become dysfunctional, even if their constituencies move away, because you don't have, first of all, you don't have the same kind of boards, you don't have the same compliance requirements, and you don't have activists. It takes a lot for a not-for-profit to feel the same pain. So, I think it's really hard to get meaningful change, in a not-for-profit. I think it happens a lot quicker in a corporate context.
Thanks for sharing a great presentation. What I'm interested in knowing is that, were there any surprises for you in this study, either in terms of the factors that you came up with, or even in terms of how you related it to demographics? Like, I'm personally intrigued by the fact that it was not correlated to earned income, and how you say age is not a factor, and how do you explain those surprises?
Well, I'll say with factor analysis, if you end up with surprises, it means you start over, because you can't interpret factors without a theory. So if it wouldn't have been consistent with the theory, then I would have had essentially nothing to report. I would have said, it doesn't meet this model, start over and do another model. As far as if there was anything that was even close to a surprise, it was probably the age. Because population ecology theory would argue that entrepreneurship should occur in younger organizations because inertia should build up as organizations get older. I think, in the nonprofit sector, you could argue inertia, for the reasons that were mentioned, is even a more serious issue, so more meaningful change could be challenging. I anticipated, because I was somewhat trained in economics. I'm not a, full-scale economist, but I've known for some time that entrepreneurship and, if earned income was entrepreneurship, then the entire for-profit sector would be entrepreneurs, right? Because that's all they earn, is earned income. And so it had to be something different. And so I would have been surprised if that wouldn't have bore out to be true. I think it was, and I don't mean this in a cantankerous way, but I think that applying earned income as entrepreneurship is just really sloppy theory.
What I was interested in the study, and I don't know whether it'll happen, is so what? So we had these two groups, and he proved that, one group was entrepreneurial and one group was not. And I was eager to see, were the entrepreneurial organizations better? And I know you're getting into this effectiveness thing, and you're from Kansas City.
Socially
so
constructed.
It's socially constructed. It's whatever the stakeholders say it is. But I really wanted to see the net income of the agencies. But I figured
we're moving in that direction now.
Yeah, but the sample would have. They didn't get to the foundation page if they were slouchy. So my guess is that you would have found.
I'll give you a quick follow-up, and I know Ray and
Ray
one
had a
other,
comment.
is that two of the organizations that were entrepreneurial were in cycles of decline when we went back to do qualitative studies, and which I don't know if I'd say is surprising. So it wasn't necessary that they were achieving well just because they were doing these things, and that's why I said this isn't a value model. This isn't this model better than not doing this at all. I'm just trying to organize this is a strategy model more than it is anything else. We are beginning to look at now around at least some financial performance as it relates to these type of behaviors.
Yeah, I thought that it was never in the paper. You never crossed that line. I mean, it was clear what you were doing. It's just intriguing with what you said, Ray, about I think you said sketchy is the word that you used. That most of these agencies were sketchy, and so I was curious. Well, was it, are you paving the way for the early adopters, or what value is it a good thing, not a good thing? So it was interesting. Ray, you had a comment?
Yeah, I would just build on your point and yours actually. Just it would be very interesting, like as you follow this, to see what sorts of things, if not, the earned income thing, because you weren't looking at that necessarily, but you're looking at maybe financial or outcome things, but just of what kinds of contextual things that those behaviors are tied to. Because, there would be probably some very interesting patterns or stories in that.
Well, and that is the next phase for us, and right now, Dave Renz and I are beginning to launch a study on governance, systems, and behaviors. So we'll look at internal dynamics, board structure, what are characteristics, trying to build a typology of organizations like this versus organizations not like this. I will say some of the qualitative work we have followed up with has looked at that the entrepreneurial managers are far more involved in both bridging and bonding networks. We're trying to bring in some of the network research consistent with Putnam and the others around those. We do see things like very not strictly isomorphic behaviors, but some that could be leaning that way. I mean, they all do some form of business planning, but sometimes it's not just isomorphism; it's practical. It has a practical implication. They do all look at ROI. Now we've looked at this qualitatively. We're trying to continue now that we have a statistic we believe we can use as a dependent variable. We're going to begin to look at some of those other characteristics moving forward.
What was the dependent variable?
In this study?
Well, no, I mean, what would you be looking at?
We have by averaging, we have a kind of a crude index of entrepreneurial behavior that we'll use as a dependent we can use as a dependent in studies now.
So you're gonna, the next phase is that you're gonna look at the 57 and the 400, you're gonna look at that population?
Well, what we could do now is just randomly select any group of organizations, give them the scale, and ask them other questions and see how their score on the scale relates to those other questions.
And then parse them into the two groups and?
We would maybe, but we wouldn't necessarily even have to, because if this is a measure of entrepreneurship behavior, then we can see how other behaviors either impact entrepreneurial behavior or vice versa. How does entrepreneurial behavior impact other things like revenue generation?
My question looks back to the organizational versus personal impact. And I'm curious who completed the instrument for the organization, and whether you looked at all or asked at all to see if those were whether those were founders or members of the founding team.
We didn't ask that, which is would have been a good question. It was generally executives of the organization. Our thought process was that boards turn over with some frequency, and let's be honest, I could tell you that boards are the strategic leaders of nonprofit organizations, but let's just be honest. That's good theory.
So it was boards, not CEOs?
No, it was CEOs. It was CEOs, and the founding. We did ask tenure. We asked how long they'd been there in that position. Again, we didn't find it. We ran correlations with everything. We didn't find a relationship.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in this risk-taking.
Sure.
I'm interested in the risk-taking question. Did you have a sense of the timeliness when you said that the behavior gets disrupted, the organization gets disrupted?
As far as?
Well, if that's a criteria for being classified as entrepreneurial, what if the disruption occurred before?
We asked in the last 5 years, have you made decisions that disrupted staff stability? So we made decisions that were against the norms of your operating environment, and made decisions that potentially impact your public image. So we asked, generically, did you make decisions that did this?
So part of the criteria is you needed to have some disruption already occurring. I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't, I should say that, and a couple points on risk-taking. One, risk-taking is not a very good capture of this, but that's what's in the paper, so that's what I presented. We're moving more to risk tolerance, because entrepreneurs aren't risk-taking. They're not, if you give them a risk-taking scale, if you give them ask them, do you take risks? They'll tell you no across the board. They tend to be risk tolerant. They tend to operate in areas that most people objectively would say that's risky. But to them, they use heuristics that make it not necessarily that risky. That's what the for-profit literature is saying on entrepreneurship. So they're not riverboat gamblers. Two, I hope one was good because I forgot two. Oh, yes. Yeah.
I'm curious. I mean, you asked this point about, who completed the scale. Yeah. You mentioned that you looked at the demographics of the organization, but you also mentioned that there might be some changes in the organization. Did you look at the tenure of the person who was completing the survey?
Yeah, because
there was no
relationship there either.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah. Let me get that microphone. We do have a little bit of time here, so. Yeah.
Well, this is just the.
Oh, is it on?
On the fritz.
Okay, well, I'll try. This is really a point of clarification. You made a distinction between commercialization and innovation.
Yeah.
And one way to think about innovation is the translation of ideas or inventions into economic activity. And in that context, you might think of commercialization as a subset of economic activity. Is that the way you have?
That would be accurate. In the nonprofit sector, obviously, commercial or the economic activity could come from a third party. So in that sense, it wouldn't translate to traditional transaction, commercialization, earned income as we think about it in a traditional sense. So it is a subset of economic activity, but in the nonprofit sector, obviously you have government grants, you have government contracts, you have donations, you have a variety of other types of resource opportunities that aren't strictly commercialization.
Other comments, questions? Well, let's give a round of thanks.
Thank you very much.